I wanted to ask you, what was your take on Sasquatch, Bigfoot prior to your encounter?
Prior to my encounter, in my opinion, I believe prior to my encounter, anything was possible. The mountain gorillas in Africa, they were kind of the same thing. They were whispers, talks, people in the mountains would talk about them and nobody really believed it. And then somebody actually took the initiative to invest their money to find them and prove it. And now they find that there's a lot more than they know. And that was kind of my take, was that anything was possible.
Right before your encounter, what were you doing?
Before my first encounter, what was I doing?
Yeah, kind of lead us up into the encounter and tell us what happened and kind of what you were doing.
Okay. That was in 2001. I was actually going up to go preseason scouting for archery elk hunting in Oregon in the Cascade Mountains. It was the opening day of bear season, and so I took the opportunity to go to one of my favorite areas that I love to archery hunt and do a little scouting for bear and cougar and also looking for elk. Not necessarily to shoot bear. I like seeing them. They're a beautiful animal. So I went into this clear cut in an area where it was probably 10 to 15-year-old clear cut, still had some openings in it. There were a lot of huckleberries in the area. It was also an area where I would see a lot of black-tailed deer. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to use a lost fawn call to try and lure some animals because there would already be natural scent in the area. So it wouldn't be out of the norm for that vicinity that I was in. It's also an area where at the top edge of this clear cut to the east and uphill from me, 300 yards away, there's a band of older growth that's probably 25 to 30 years old that had been cut prior to that had regrown and was really thick, and the elk like to actually move through that because it was a really protected band that they could slide through, and they weren't out in the open, and it was a lot of fur, so it was easy for them to move through the trees. When I got up in there, wind was perfect. Wind was coming actually downhill, going from the east to the west down into the drainage, and I set up on an old growth stump about 8 feet up. I was standing on it so I could look out over the clear cut. There were a few blacktail actually in the edge of the clear cut feeding when I started calling, and they didn't really seem to mind the call because to them it sounded like a lost fawn, so they just came a little closer. After the second series of calls, which was probably 10 minutes, I heard a loud noise. I don't know exactly how to describe it, what it was that I heard. I think like how I described it to you yesterday was kind of like when you hear a bull moose slam its horn against a tree in a challenge, just a loud thwack. And then I could hear something moving down, and my first reaction was like, well, that's weird. An elk wouldn't respond to it like this. If anything, a cow would let out a call. She'd whistle, to me, or mew to try and locate her cache. A bull wouldn't hit his horn. So I did it again, and then it started coming down through the trees, slightly to the northeast of that, coming down through, which is an older stand of firs that's really thickly populated with, in the undergrowth is all really large rhododendrons, and that fir, it's really dark in there. I've been in there a couple times. It's kind of creepy area to be in. It proceeded to come down, and I called again. It did a very guttural roar. And at that moment, I knew that it wasn't anything I'd ever encountered. It wasn't a bear, definitely wasn't a cougar or deer, elk. All the deer that were there, there were 2 black-tailed does and a couple fawns. They scattered as soon as the roar happened. They didn't look back. They didn't hesitate or snort. They just ran. And I didn't move at that point because I don't know if it was curiosity or fear a little bit, but I just stood there, and it was about 300 yards at this point, and it was coming down, and I could see trees shaking violently, see things getting knocked over, hear things getting broken, see things being thrown in the air, and it kind of went up and down the edge of the clear cut. Never came more than probably 150 yards from me, but it would just go back and forth, just screaming and violently attacking its surroundings. I stood there as long as I could, and one of the times when it went uphill, I decided to hastily vacate the area as fast as I could, and I jumped and ran. Just tried to keep as much in between me and it, so hopefully it wouldn't see me. And I sprinted down to the road and down to my car, and when I got to my car, I could still hear it going off. I mean, this was start to finish the whole experience. It was probably 20 minutes.
And you never really got a good look at it, did you?
That time, no, I never got a good look at it. It was one of those situations where I kind of wanted to stay there and press my luck and see, but it got to the point where I was watching trees that I could see that I know were my forearm diameter getting broken, and then parts of it getting thrown through the air into the clearing.
When you left, did you talk to anyone about this? What was kind of your thought process after this whole thing happened? You got back to your car and...
My thought process at that point was to get some distance in between whatever it was and me, because the way I was going, I actually had to kind of come downhill and around to the end of the clear cut to that side where it was going up and down. I wasn't sure if I was even going to run into something at that point, if it was going to be because of how it was going up and down the edge. I just got away from there. I kind of went a few miles down the road to a little lake that's in the area and hopped out and sat there for a bit, running through my head, okay, what was that experience? What I think I know what that was, but I'm not sure because I couldn't physically see it. But when I got home later that night, I didn't tell anybody really, because I wasn't sure what I would say it was. But when I got home, I remember I was watching a nature show, and there was videos of chimpanzees getting ready to fight, and the one was getting itself worked up, and it was grabbing logs and thrashing everything and springing back and forth and throwing stuff and getting more. And I'm like, oh my God, that is exactly what I just witnessed right there. Was a very primal instinct in a creature to work itself up to a fight, basically to the death or whatever, to protect its territory, which it was me that it was going to protect it from.
It's interesting because a lot of people describe that behavior right before something bad kind of happens. They'll talk about them working themselves up. It's almost like it was trying to work itself up into attacking. It makes you wonder what had set this thing off, while you're up there. But so you go back and it's going through your mind on probably what this is or, what it could be. And then what was the next encounter that you had?
In the same area, and that one was at the opposite end of the same ridge. It's about, I actually have my map right here, and I'm looking at the scale, and it is actually almost exactly 3 miles in a straight line from that spot. It was the end of the elk hunting season, towards the end of September. my oldest son, he was 4 at the time. He wanted to see some elk. He'd never seen an elk before in the wild, so I took him up there to an area where there's a bench just to the north that's kind of got some cliffy outcroppings to the west side of it, and then that overlook it, and then it drops down, and then the bench below it's all kind of rim rocky cliffs, and then it wraps around to this large clear cut, which is where I took my son to the edge of this clear cut, and the elk will filter on and off of that bench and down into the drainage below to feed, and to, you know, in that time of year, the bulls will drop down in there too to hook up with the groups of cows and try and find their mates, you know. It was getting towards evening, and I took him in there. My ex-wife was with me. We were still together at that time. We had walked in from our car probably a little over half a mile in on this old skid road, and we dropped down the edge of the clear cut to where there's a trail that the elk will get onto this trail and pretty much use it almost every day to get on and off of this bench. I set up, had him slightly uphill and to the south of me, more for safety. And I started calling, doing a lead cow call. After probably a half hour, you know, you only let a couple calls off here and there, break a few branches, make it sound like something's walking through. You could hear the elk back up to our north of us coming off of the bench. They started doing a little mews and chirps, and you can hear them moving down. And then below us, I could hear something else coming, a little heavier sound to it. It proceeded to move up the hill, and I was thinking, well, maybe that's a bull coming in. Maybe we'll get lucky and we'll see a couple bulls challenge each other. So I told him, you know, I whispered over to him, like, just make sure you're quiet, calm. You know, they probably won't mind you. You're small. So they're going to pass right in front of us. I was looking to my left, to the north. About that time, I saw the lead cow. She started coming in, and all of a sudden she stopped, and she's staring. And I thought she was staring at my son at first. And then I realized she was staring kind of downhill from me. And I was looking to my right at this point. I didn't really turn my head. I'd move my eyes. I could see a black mass, maybe 15 yards downhill from my son, standing there looking at him. And my first reaction was bear. And so I turned and looked, and I visibly saw the flat face, see the broad shoulders with it hump up into the head. There was no muzzle. There was no flat top on the head where you get that broad forehead of the bear with the ears on the other side. This thing was probably 8 feet tall. When I turned my head, it saw me, and its reaction was to, with its hands, reach down and grab the rhododendron in front of it and lift the branches up in front of it to block its face and hold them there. At that point, I knocked an arrow and drew my bow and stepped in between it and my son. And then the realization set in that this thing was there basically to feed, pick my kid as the target. And I very rapidly, I let the arrow down, got my son and my ex-wife, I pushed them out into the clear cut, and I just told them to go. Just don't stop, don't look back, no matter what they hear, no matter what they see, don't turn around. Go for the car. I stayed about 20 yards or so behind them and just walked facing to the east, so I was facing downhill, so that way my hand was behind me, so if it did come, I could try and get one shot off, hopefully. And it didn't move. It just stayed where it was, and I walked them all the way to the other side of the clear cut, and it was almost dark, and we at that point, I ran them up to the truck, to the skid road, and then to the truck as fast as possible. And we drove to the other end of the ridge to get away from there. I never told her why. She never asked me why. She was a little freaked out that I was freaked out because she'd never really seen me like that before. She's like, you're always calm when you're in the woods. You know, you go in the dark, things don't bug you. What's wrong? I'm like, don't worry about it.
I wanted to ask you, did you ever get a good look at the face?
The face, yeah. I mean, I don't remember all the little individual details, but I remember it was like almost like a bonobo kind of, that flat face, the lips, broad jaw, forehead. But mainly the one thing I remember the most was its hands reaching down and physically grabbing onto the rhododendron bush and pulling upwards to cover its face, to hide when I stepped out and drew. Like it knew.
Yeah, it knew.
Intention.
Yeah.
It knew my intentions, and I knew its intentions, and they were on the same path.
Yeah, it's amazing the creature never got up to leave. It just kind of stayed there, watched you guys take off. Did your son, I didn't realize this was years back, but did your son ever see the creature? Or did he have his back to it?
I never asked him. He was kind of just sitting there, kind of playing with some sticks and, waiting for the elk to kind of come down in front of us. So I don't think if he noticed it, he never said anything to me about it. He never said like, hey daddy, look, what's that? He just kept doing his thing. I know my ex, she was oblivious. She was facing to the north, so it was to her right. So she never even saw it. I think she was leaning on a tree, if I remember correctly. So her view would have been completely blocked of it. And he was sitting about maybe 5 yards away from her, kind of towards me, towards the north of her, in between her and I. So he was kind of sitting there by himself in the woods.
Let me ask you, do you ever, so you had the encounter where the thing's tearing apart the forest, almost semi-hostile coming towards you, but, letting you know to basically leave, doing a display to leave. And then you're out again with your family, and now you've seen it, and so I'm sure it's not hard to put two and two together. Does it ever cross your mind to just stop hunting? I mean, were you not worried, hey, while these things I've heard them and now I've actually seen one, what keeps you hunting?
I like to eat as organically as possible. In my mind, I've had sow bears aggressively charge me, ripping up brush, popping their jaw, woofing at you, fully, hackled up, tearing stuff up because their cub is up a tree right beside me because it walked out of the huckleberry bushes and came over to play with my boot strings, and I didn't see them there. Those situations happen. It's like I think like I described it to you last night was if you're surfing, eventually you're going to run into a shark. Does that stop you from getting back in the ocean? No. It's this situation was something, again, where it was like, okay, I was very, very unlucky and lucky at the exact same time because I was able to see this creature and validate in my mind what I thought was up there. At the same time, it was coming to feed on something.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I put myself and my son and my ex-wife in that.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where I kind of stayed away from that area, for a few weeks, and then I slowly went back in there, and I was always cautious. I mean, I'm not going to lie and say it didn't scare me.
Yeah, no, and I understand that, especially the surfer analogy. That's a pretty good analogy, I guess. You decide to keep hunting, and you decide that, and everyone out there, this is happening over a period of time. It's not like one day this happened and the next day this happened. But you decided to go back out to that area and hunt. Have you ever had an encounter while you're out there that made you think twice about hunting beyond the incident with your son and the first time that you heard it? Was there another time that you had an encounter where you thought, what am I doing out here?
There were two, actually. The one was the following year with a very good friend of mine. We were, from that first encounter, we were about 1.25 miles away from that first encounter towards the second encounter. There's a saddle with a nice flat bench that kind of drops down into this draw that's got a lot of really thick rhododendrons. There's actually a lot of caves and rock outcroppings down in there. And we had come up through there, and I was still in the roadies, and I was calling a bull elk that was out on the bench in front of us displaying, and my buddy had slowly worked his way up there. He was following, trying to, him the bull. He kept trying to get in front of it to cut it off, and I kept trying to slow it with my calls, and I would kind of move around pretending like I was a couple different animals, and it was starting to get dark, and I had started to slide out of the roadies into the clear cut where the bull was, and at this point they were ways away, and I didn't realize the distance that they had gotten away from me at that point because we were separated. I started to hear kind of like, almost like chatter, like a monkey chatter. Took me by surprise because it was very close, but it seemed like it was above me, almost up in the trees, in the stand of old firs that I had just come out of. So I had turned around, and I was facing the timber, which was getting really dark, and I started to hear a really low growl, which was on the ground in front of me. I started backing away. I knocked an arrow. I put my back up into a small clump of firs. There was one clearly chattering to another one that was, I was facing east at this point, and this one was kind of up there. I swear it was like it was up in the trees watching me. And the one on the ground was below it was growling. And then the one that was to the north of me, to my left, was slightly uphill, and they were talking back and forth. And it was almost like it was telling it where to go to find me. I could hear it sliding through the brush. His hair on leaves makes a very distinct sound when animals are moving through brush. I could very clearly hear it circling kind of behind me. At that point, I slipped into the trees that were behind me, and I got down to try and get below the boughs, and I started crawling through the little stand of saplings there, so that way I wasn't disturbing it. When I did that, the one that was doing most of the chattering got very frantic, and then the other one got even more frantic that was above me, kind of circling, and the growling got very, very loud and more aggressive, like not just growling, but there were other noises kind of going on. I crawled for probably 20 yards until I came to a little opening, and I stood up and I started running, and I ran uphill about 150 yards. There's a skid road, and I got on that road. Unfortunately, had to run in the opposite direction of my vehicle because my vehicle was about 1 mile away to the north on that skid road. I ran until I couldn't see anything, and I stopped, turned on my radio, radioed my buddy. Luckily, he was only probably another half mile beyond where I was at that point. We met up, and I kind of told him what had happened, and he said, well, I guess we're going to have a lot longer walk home tonight. So what do you mean? So I'm not going back up there. So if you heard what you said you heard and experienced that, I'm not. He's like, I know you wouldn't jerk around with me like that. He's like, we'll take the long way. We'll walk around the loop road. It's going to, which is probably gave us about a 5-mile walk back to the truck versus a mile.
And I still can't believe you hunt. After you've seen like 3 sharks in the water, every surfer, I'm sure they see sharks in the water, but I'm sure after the 3rd or 4th time, you got to be thinking, God, is it worth hunting anymore?
Yeah, that experience was I would say that was enough to scare me out. I mean, I left that ridge for the rest of that hunting season. I went to another area that I knew really well, which isn't far from there. It's probably only 5 miles from there. But I've never had any encounters like that over there. There's the same amount of game in both areas, but I just never had any experiences or heard any calls or anything like I had in that area.
Most of the encounters and experiences that you're having, it's while you're hunting. After something like this, do you decide, hey, I want to go out and kind of look for this thing? Now
I look back on it and I wish maybe I had a helmet cam on or something, so I could have recorded some of this stuff, especially, the noises that I heard, because they're not like anything I've ever heard. I've had cougars hiss at me. I've had bears popping their jaws and woofing at me, and I've had bull elk standing 10 yards away screaming their brains out and chuckling and whistling. Lots of different deer calls, fox, coyote. Had the pleasure when I was younger in the Boy Scouts to hear wolves, howling up in Canada. And, nothing compared to what I heard. It shook you, like the growling especially, because it was like you could feel it, like, when people say something shakes them to the core, like that really, this is the best way to describe it, because the growl that this thing did, it physically, I could feel it in my body to the point where it was like, okay, this isn't a joke. This is...
Yeah, it's getting real at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like when you read a story, of the old African big game hunters who used to hunt the lions, and they talk about how right before the lion charges, that one noise that it makes. When you hear that one noise, you know that thing's coming for you. And there's only one shot that you have to live. And the noise that this thing was making in my mind, and even though I never heard that noise before, it was something that I knew was a very dangerous game that I just got myself involved in.
One thing I wanted to ask you, can you describe to the audience, because I've tried to describe it before in the past, and I don't know that I do a great job describing it, but can you kind of describe the monkey chatter you're talking about, or the chatter?
The chatter was like very primal, like a primate, like kind of when you hear recordings of chimpanzees is the best way I can describe it, slightly like that, like when they're kind of doing the little chatters and the looting, like the, and I've tried myself to mimic the chatters, and I just can't make the noise. I don't know why.
It's really, really hard to describe it too and put your finger on it.
Yeah, but you could definitely tell that these two were talking to each other. And that's not the first time I've heard that up there. I've heard it one other time where they were talking to each other. I described that to you yesterday. That was actually the following year that I heard that. And that was long distance talking to each other. They were probably over a mile apart when they first started doing the noises. And that was the looting noise, like the and I would hear it, and then you'd hear a higher pitched one. And then you'd hear the lower pitched one downhill in the draw. And then you'd hear the higher pitched one on the ridge closer. And then the low pitched one even closer. And then the high pitched one right there, less than 100 yards. And then my buddy and I realized that, wait a minute, we're right in between these things, and they're about to meet up right where we're standing almost. And they came together and were talking like that, like I describe it as a looting noise, you know, that like what you hear primates do to each other to locate each other.
I think that is a locator call, that whoop.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, and I got the bright idea to mimic it when they came together and were out in front of us, and you could hear that they were within only, I mean, the one was, if I'm staring straight forward, it was probably 11 o'clock, maybe 100 yards. The other one was like almost 1 o'clock, like 75 yards. I, in the dark, we were right at my car actually at this point. We'd just gotten done hunting for the day, and I let out a call. As soon as the high-pitched one called, I called, and the lower-pitched one didn't like it. You just heard like this, not to the extent of the first encounter where it was breaking stuff up, running up and down in clear-cut growl, or that scream that it did, but a very guttural, growly scream, you know, enough to make me pee a little bit. And my buddy started screaming. My car was still locked and was kicking my door, trying to break the window in so he could get in. I, you know, got the vehicle open, and we got in there and tore out of there. I stupidly went back the next day.
Well, what did your buddy say? I'm kind of curious. You guys are driving off. Has he experienced anything like that before? Or?
No, he had never experienced anything like that before. His first reaction was to punch me and call me a bunch of names. Then his second reaction was, I think I know what that is. What do you think that is, Noah? And I said, I know exactly what that is, Jeff. It's the same thing that I told you about with Orion and Megan, with Christian, with the other experience, bear hunting. He called me a few choice words. Said, I don't know if I want to hunt up here with you anymore. He said, well, the elk hunting's great. That's why I keep coming back. He said, you're a fool. You should carry a gun. I said, I know. We left, went to his parents' house, and we walked in. He was still ghost white, visibly shaken, and his dad just started laughing. And his dad said, you look like you just saw Sasquatch, son. His dad's an old logger. And I just kind of laughed, you know, a little bit. And he's like, what'd you see? And we told him we didn't. I'm like, we didn't see it. It was in the dark. But this is what we heard. This is what happened. And he said, yeah, there's things in the mountains you don't mess with up here. You know, all the old loggers have encountered them. Why do you think the Native Americans stayed out of these mountains?
Yeah, I'm sure he's seen enough out there in Oregon being a logger. I'm sure he's encountered these things a few times.
If he did, he never told us about them. You know, I know other loggers that lived in the town that I lived in that had stories, you know, having 50-gallon drums of oil thrown at them in the dark. Not in this area where I was at, but other areas in the mountains. But
why did you go back the next day?
Curiosity. I think, too, there was a lot of activity, elk activity in that area that year. There were a lot of large bulls they'd kind of broken the herd up, and they had kind of all posted themselves along this ridge, and there were little small herds, and they kind of mingle here and there and fight for cows and then go their separate ways. And so I went back to hunt, and the next morning, and I went, parked in the exact same spot, and I walked off of that ridge kind of to the southeast towards where the one with the deeper voice came from. And I went about a quarter mile, and it was dark. I mean, this was probably 3:30 in the morning, maybe 3:45 at this point, because I usually like to walk for anywhere up to 2 hours, you know, just slow walking, you know, not like a march, but, you know, I'll take a few steps, listen, take a few steps, listen, and kind of get into an area that I want to start hunting, and then I'll sit there for an hour in the dark until first light, and then I'll start my hunt. So that way I don't bump game. And I had just started to enter the timber. I heard a really loud kind of like thud. It was very close to me. It was in the dark. Thankfully, the wind was in the right direction, so whatever it was there couldn't smell me. I just stood there, and I heard something snapping bones, tearing her flesh, something being consumed. And it wasn't, I know it wasn't coyotes, because coyotes will fight, bark and whimper and howl, and, you know, they have their whole sing-song they go through, and the cougar would have drug off whatever it was and shoot it a little bit, buried it, come back. A bear would have done the same thing. It would have grabbed whatever it was, and then it would have just, you know, it would have eaten, but it wouldn't have been, the noises that I was hearing were violently dismembering of this animal. I just froze. I didn't move. I stood there up against the tree I was standing by until first light, which was probably an hour or more after that happened. And I started to move, and as I started down into the timber slowly, I started seeing lots of blood. There were the four hooves of the deer were left. The leg bones had been snapped off. Carcass was very little left of it. You know, there was part of the skull with a little hair. There was a little bit of the backbone left. Most of it had been eaten. There was a lot of blood. I just kind of, okay, well, there's obviously a very large predator still here. Hopefully it's not hungry. And I kept going. Got down into the bottom. There were no elk around. It was kind of one of those days where didn't really hear many birds. Squirrels were quiet. All the animals were quiet, you know, and I decided to get out of there. So I started heading back up to that draw, which is roadies that are probably anywhere from 8 to 15 feet tall. And I'm kind of working my way up through there, and I saw what I thought was a log at first, and then all of a sudden it jumped up on two legs and ran up the hill, and I cow called, and it stopped. I'm like, okay, I just saw a cinnamon-colored bipedal creature moving away from me in the exact line I need to go. I'm like, I want to see this. I got to see this. I picked my way up through there as slow as I could. And then I kind of got to this spot in the roadies where it opened up. And I just stood up, and I slowly slid out of the roadies into the edge of the opening. And to my left, and about 5 yards away, and about maybe 2.5 feet above my head. You know, I'm 5'10". This thing was probably 2.5 feet above me, standing on the same level of the mountain. Looking down on me was a face. And I turned and I looked at it and I clearly saw its lips, saw the flatter nose, kind of looked like a bonobo's face, like, but on steroids. It was huge. Amber colored eyes, dark skin, like a darker brown skin with cinnamon colored hair. And I clearly looked at it and it clearly knew what I was. And it turned and it ran. It was so freaking fast. And my curiosity got the best of me and I ran after it because I wanted to see more. Because I knew it. I knew. I don't even know how to describe it. Like the feeling I'm getting right now, just seeing that face again, and it ran, and just watching it turn, and the look of surprise, like it couldn't believe that I walked up on it like that. And then I ran because I wanted to see more. And as I ran, it was going down this small game trail I've walked a bunch of times, and as I jumped onto the trail, it stepped off at about 15 yards, was standing there, and it was just kind of swaying back and forth, like not standing completely upright, but kind of in that crouched position, like an animal, like a spring that's just loaded and ready to explode out of there. And I just remember I could clearly see the roadies moving, and I could clearly see its color as it was rocking back and forth. And I just said, okay, I'm going to leave now, out loud, talking calmly, kind of like you would to a bear. And I turned around and I started walking. And I just tried not to run. In my head, if I run, I'm dead. The only thing I can do is I can try and stay calm, try and get as much distance between me and it, and get the hell out of these woods. And that kept me out of there for a while.
You're sitting there, now you're too close, but you got such a great look at the face. What was your impression looking at it? I know you had mentioned bonobo, but did you get any impression that they have a very human look? I mean, how would you kind of describe it?
I would say like a primate. Just that's the best way I can describe it, like a primate. It didn't have a muzzle like a bear. It didn't have a nose with a bridge like humans have. It had where its lips were kind of rolled up, and the nose was kind of just flattened off, kind of like you would see in a bonobo or a chimpanzee, a gorilla, that type of primate face. And then just those amber-colored eyes that were facing forward, they weren't, set on the front of its face just like a primate. And, my impression was, holy shit, I'm looking at a giant monkey or a gorilla or something of that sort that, everybody's calling it this, but I'm not calling it that because it's something incredible.
Yeah.
It's scary.
I know you don't live in Oregon anymore. Do you kind of miss it? Do you want to ever go back up to that area?
I definitely do. I've been back in that area once since then. I spent a little over a week up there with some buddies, taking them elk hunting in that area because I didn't really know that area that well. I saw one in that time period, which was actually following behind two of my friends, watching them. And it clearly looked just like a bonobo, like the pictures you see. That's the best way to describe it. They're beautiful, I think, but I think people, cuddly, happy little creatures that's, I'm not going to run up and hug it, not unless I want to commit suicide.
Yeah, and even like the last encounter, you were kind of pushing your luck, I think, on that one. I think I'm glad that he didn't end up disappearing, running up on it the way it was swaying. And it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. I think they worked themselves up into attacking.
Yeah.
I don't think they just snap, and I think they have to work themselves up.
I don't know if you've spent a lot of time around bears, but bears will kind of like, they're curious animals, you know. They're very curious animals, and they'll kind of like look, and they'll get a little closer, and they'll look, and then they'll get scared and they'll run away. Or that's how they get themselves worked up. But this thing was not doing that. This thing was clearly an aggressive stance, like legs apart, arms kind of out slightly, hunched over, swaying back and forth, you know, head moving. You know, it was visibly sitting there showing me, you know, you sure, you know, it's basically telling me, are you sure you want to go down this road? You know, and I luckily stopped. I have a feeling if I would have probably only taken one more step, two more steps, we would, you know, we'd never had a conversation.
That would have been it. No, I want to thank you for being on the show, and I want to thank you for coming forward, talking about the different experiences that you had. I know you didn't really want to, but I appreciate you accepting the offer to come forward and just talk about it.
Well, I'm glad I could share them. It's, you know, I think what you guys are trying to do is a great thing. I appreciate the opportunity. Appreciate giving me a little time to tell my story.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the show, everyone. I want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight. If you get a chance, please visit us at SasquatchChronicles.com. If you've had an encounter and you'd like to come on the show, please email me at wes@SasquatchChronicles.com. I'd love to talk with you. I'd love to have you on the air. So if you've had an encounter, shoot me an email. Again, it's wes@SasquatchChronicles.com. Before we get started tonight, one of the things I wanted to talk about was lights. And what do I mean by that? About a year ago, a gentleman came to me who is, very level-headed, very sane, very rational. And he said, Wes, can I talk to you privately? I said, sure. And he said, let me ask you, out of all the witnesses you talk to, has anyone ever talked about balls of light in the forest? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, when I was out in an area where I know Sasquatch is, I saw these balls of light. And I said, describe them to me. And he said, well, it's a little bit bigger than a softball, but smaller than a basketball. I've seen different colors. I've seen blue, and I've seen yellow. And he says they just kind of appear to be intelligently controlled, and they just kind of go through the forest. They don't really do anything. He said it's just a really strange phenomena I witnessed, and I'm not really sure what to think about that. So as the show went on, I've talked to many hunters. I've talked to many hikers, people who aren't really into Bigfoot, that have come to me and said, hey, I saw these lights, and here's kind of what I saw. And they describe the lights the same way. They describe these balls of light, kind of like a plasma ball, different colors. The main color, I would say, the most I've heard so far is kind of a bluish color, a lighted ball flying through the forest. Now, while this may seem strange to most people listening, I've heard this so many times it's kind of hard to ignore at this point. People have brought me pictures. I have videos of these strange balls of lights flying through the forest. And one of the things that made me think of, in World War II, pilots, United States and Allied pilots were seeing these balls of lights as they flew over Germany, and they called them Foo Fighters.
In the 1940s, as waves of American bombers were literally obliterating German cities, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin. In these raids, American fighter pilots saw these balls of light coming at their planes. They didn't know what they were. They thought they were German secret weapons at first, so they called them Foo Fighters. The word feu in French is fire, and these were balls of fire coming out. So, instead of Feu Fighters, they were Foo Fighters.
They were seen in large numbers over Germany and over Western Europe, where they were described variously as structured craft or simply balls of light.
That was so important at the time that the military began to notice it, and they began to investigate these things. There are hundreds of cases. None seemed to be very harmful to planes, but they were all over the place.
Curiously, when the Foo Fighters appeared, Allied aircraft would sometimes experience mechanical failure. And perhaps most mystifying of all was that some pilots reported flying right through the UFOs as if they had no mass. It was never discovered what the Foo Fighters were or where they came from. But the theory that they were some sort of German secret weapon was widely accepted among Allied pilots at the time.
And while these might be two separate things going on between the Foo Fighters and what people are seeing today, you know, I don't think I've heard too many references of people seeing balls of light in the sky. What a lot of people are describing is balls of light going through the forest, actually maneuvering through the forest and being relatively small. I had a hunter one time who listens to the show. Really nice guy. Said, hey, I love the show. I don't know that I believe in Bigfoot, but I just want to let you know I love the show. And, oh, by the way, have you ever heard of anyone talking about balls of light? And he started describing, he was up in his tree stand, and right before dawn, he was in his tree stand, and this ball of light was just kind of navigating through the forest. And he said it was the strangest thing. It kind of lit up the trees as it went by, but he said it wasn't, he goes in, and I want the audience to understand, I'm not talking about a UFO flying through a tree. What he was describing, he said it was a little bit bigger than a softball, and it just kind of went through the forest, navigating the forest, lighting up the forest as it went, and he said it just kind of went off on its own, and it was gone, and it was the strangest thing he had seen. So I'm kind of curious on your feedback. What do you think these balls of lights are that people are seeing, and have you seen them? I'd love to hear from you. If you shoot me an email, wes@sasquatchchronicles.com, I'd love your input on it. Next on the show, we have Mike, and Mike had a pretty interesting encounter when he was a kid. I want to go ahead and welcome Mike to the show.
How are you?
All right. I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay.
I want to welcome you to the show. And Mike, can you tell us when the encounter occurred and kind of what you were doing that kind of led up to the encounter?
Well, the encounter occurred in August of 1983. I was 11 years old, and I typically spent the summers in Audrain County between Centralia and Mexico, Missouri, and had a really idyllic childhood in the summertime. I did a lot of squirrel hunting and a lot of fishing, and my cousin and I went fishing over at my great grandparents, and we caught some fish. And one of the fish we caught was a catfish, and for some reason we wanted to keep it alive. So the best thing we could think of was to put it in my grandparents' creek, which during that time is kind of a dry year, from what I remember from helping my grandpa do the gardening. Is the creek was a series of intermittent puddles, and we put the catfish there. The next day we went to retrieve that catfish, and immediately discovered that it was not there. The water was really muddied up, and there was 2 footprints that I noticed right by the creek, and they were big and they were very fresh. And of course the catfish was gone. Big, barefooted, human-shaped tracks. They weren't necessarily human-sized unless you were Shaquille O'Neal or something like that. Pretty big.
And so being 11, what did you think?
I really didn't know what to think, and I think maybe I might have had some exposure to the word Bigfoot, maybe even seen like a children's book or something like that. And so I did think that after thinking about it, that, you know, my first thought was, what's somebody doing out here with no shoes on? But they were so big that I thought maybe that, yeah, it could have been a Bigfoot. And
And so what happened next? You saw the tracks, your fish is gone. You see the tracks, and then you and your cousin, what did you guys discuss it? What are these tracks? What's
Well,
doing?
do you ever have that feeling like when you're walking up a flight of stairs in the dark and you feel like it's kind of an irrational, feel like something's right behind you? It's kind of I just felt like we were being watched, and it was kind of a overwhelming, I don't know how to describe it really, other than it was kind of an overwhelming, just kind of, we were scared. So we ran back up to my grandparents' house. My uncle was there, my grandma and grandpa were both there, and I told them, you know, what had happened, what I had seen, and basically got, oh, you didn't see that, a raccoon must have came and got it, and, you know, I wanted them to go down and look at the footprints. Nobody would even walk down there with me to go look at them. Kind of got poo-pooed about it, you know, ridiculed a little bit. You know, like, why would someone be out there with no shoes on, and things of that nature. So, it was a little while later is when the second part of this happened. When I was sitting out went out and sat on the swing set. I was kind of trying to soak it all in and just kind of thinking about what had just happened. So, and that's when I actually saw it. And you know, the only thing that I know for sure is that I was sitting there on the swing and looking out into the woods, and I saw movement pretty much directly in front of me. And there was a group of really dense saplings and bushes, probably at about, I want to guess, probably 4 foot off the ground. Something parted the bushes and looked at me. With it, like, saw its hands part the bushes, and it like poked its head out and looked at me.
How far away do you think it was? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
About 50 yards. About 50 yards.
So this thing's about 50 yards from you. What did it look like?
What I remember the most about it is it had reddish brown hair, about the color of an orangutan. And its face it had a very wide mouth. It looked like it had a very wide mouth, a flat nose, grayish around its face, and the eyes appeared like they were really big. It seemed like big eyes. And the best way I could have described it as a kid is it looked like halfway between an orangutan and a person.
And what did it do? So it poked out and it looked at you, and you're looking at it.
Moved its mouth a little bit. It was moving its mouth like it was chewing or something. It didn't speak to me or anything like that.
Yeah. Did it have any sort of expressions on its face that you remember?
Yeah, it looked like it was making some kind of faces, but I couldn't really. 50 yards, you can tell a lot, but you can't tell as much as if it was, say, 20 yards or 10 yards.
Right.
You know, 50 yards, I've shot a lot of deer at 50 yards, and you can tell a lot of detail at 50 yards, but, you know, I also archery hunt. There's a lot of difference between what you can see at 10 yards or 20 yards and 50 yards.
Do you think your grandparents knew this thing was around and just kind of blew it off so you wouldn't be scared, or do you think they honestly had never heard anything, or do you think they just kind of looked the other way?
I don't think that they had any experience with it. If they had seen it or heard of something, they would have been at least forthcoming privately about it with me. So I think they were honest in their, you know, in the fact that they didn't believe it because they had never seen anything like that.
Yeah, I would imagine trying to wrap your head around this for the next couple of years, well, probably until now, has been kind of tough for you.
Oh yeah. Well, I've never backed down from, you know, what I saw, and I've taken a lot of crap from, you know, my family and cousins and aunts and uncles. I'll come into a family get together and they ask me, "Hey, have you seen Bigfoot lately?" You know, and it's been 32 years now almost since that happened.
It's kind of like one of those jokes that wasn't funny the first time, and the 10th time around, it's not real funny when they say, "Have you seen Bigfoot?" You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I've become somewhat militant in my tolerance of that, or lack of tolerance of that, because it's not something you can unsee.
And that's another thing you and I talked about. You know, there's a lot of things you wish you could unsee, you know, but you just can't. Have you tried to go out and look for the creatures since then?
Well, since that time, it has been one of my cryptozoology, and specifically has been one of my main interests that I've always kind of pursued and read stuff about. I live in a rural environment now, and there's been some weird stuff that's happened here. There hasn't been any Class A sightings that I've had, but there's some stuff that I've witnessed out here where I'm at now that are signs of their passing, so to speak, possibly. So I can't say with absolute certainty, but
yeah. Do you have any vocals out there or anything like that?
Yes, sir. I wish I had recordings of what I've heard. I have heard a roar that it seemed like it was possibly as much as a quarter mile away, but it was almost like I could still feel it in my chest. There was a time when, and it was really dumb because I wasn't thinking still about the possibility that they could be really dangerous, that they would be more shy and run away instead of be confrontational. But my son and one of his friends was camping out in the woods behind my house where I live at now, and I live on 10 acres, and there's literally hundreds of acres of forest surrounding me. It goes for a couple miles. It goes just about up to the Missouri River, and then it's right by the Little Blue River, which is in eastern Jackson County. But they were camping out there, and he called me and said, "Hey, can you bring us some food, some water?" And it was probably 10 o'clock at night. And I'm like, okay, sure. I was laughing. You know, they really went prepared camping. But there was snow on the ground, so I went and got some snow camouflage on that I had and walked out there, snuck out there with some food and some water. And I was making owl sounds and animal sounds while I was going out there in the dark with no light. And, you know, just to be funny and kind of scare them a little bit or something. And so I got up there and we got their fire going good, and got their water and their food there. And we're sitting there, and all of a sudden a coyote comes streaking right by where they were camping at. And then like 20 seconds later, another coyote comes streaking by there. You know, real close to where their campfire is and everything. And I'm going, what is going on? It seemed weird to me that they would come by that close and that fast.
Yeah.
I'm walking back, and I'm kind of thinking, you know, I'm wearing all white camouflage. So, you know, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, man, I hope that I hope one's not out here right now, which was almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm on one side of this ditch. It's kind of a dry gulch. Water goes through it when it's raining. And on the other side of the ditch, there was a tree that had fell during the summertime. So it was like it fell alive. So all the leaves were still on it in the wintertime. And it was like this dark mass in the dark. You could see on the other side. About 20 yards away, as I'm approaching it, I had my Glock out, you know, whatever. It, you know, decided that it wanted to take a bite out of me. I hear this growl coming from in this deadfall tree, which is, you know, if I was an ambush predator, it'd be a really good place to ambush because there's a deer trail that goes right by it. But I got this growl that was kind of like when I heard the roar, it was, I could feel it like in my chest. For whatever reason, I put the pistol away and just kept walking. And I was like, hey, this is not for you. It's okay. I'm not trying to hurt you. I didn't know, you know, but it sure as heck didn't sound like a coyote. And they usually aren't going to stand their ground, you know.
No, usually they'll run. Most animals will run.
Yeah.
Did you go back and get your son and say, let's get out of here? Or did you?
No, they were both armed, and they were both, planning on staying up pretty much all night. They had a good fire going, and where they were camping at was under a ledge, and it would have been pretty difficult for something to sneak up on them. They would have had to come right directly to that ledge.
Right. They're kind of
and I wasn't thinking that someone was going to come and snatch them. That could have been a bad, you know, decision on my part, but I didn't want to go back up there and tell them, hey, we need to come in and scare them, you know.
Right. Yeah.
I just let them stay out there, you know, and prayed for the best, hoped for the best. They were both armed and you know, they may have had an observer that night, but nothing bad came of it.
I wanted to ask you, going back to your first encounter, how long do you think you looked at the creature?
It was a good minute of, you know, eyeball to eyeball eye contact. And I was, at that point, I was scared. I was like frozen. I didn't know. I was like, you know, I put two and two together. That's what took the fish.
Did it just back away?
It just backed away, and that's all I saw of it.
Well, that's a pretty awesome encounter. I mean, it's something to where, you know, it makes you wonder why it popped its head out to look at you. Maybe it thought you were leaving the fish for it, or, you know, who knows?
I've asked myself that question a million times. I don't know if, you know, you hear a lot of stories about, you know, kids seeing them and they don't feel as threatened maybe by a kid.
Yeah, I would imagine it's kind of like, you know, if we saw a child Sasquatch, I think we'd be more apt to, there's not really the fear. But when you come across a full-grown male, all of a sudden now there's the fear, because you don't know what it's going to do. And I would imagine being 11 years old, you know, having that experience, that I can't imagine that wouldn't, you know, that would have to stick with you the rest of your life. And I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I tell people, I said, seeing a Bigfoot when I was 11 changed my life. It has made me think about things differently. And I see the woods in a totally different light. And to this day, I do a lot of hunting and fishing, and I hunt on my own property. I've heard knocks, like I said, I've heard knocks, I've heard vocalizations. I have smelled some weird smells out here. I've got one very bad cast of a footprint that I've found. It's definitely not a museum quality, but it is what it is.
Well, be safe out there, man.
Thanks for having me on, Wes. I really appreciate it. You know, this is the first time I've ever really shared it in this public of a setting, and I hope I did okay. So.
Oh, you did great. I wanted to ask you, I got to jump to the next interview. I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to ask you a quick question. Have you ever heard or seen any lights out there?
Yes.
I mean, like balls of light?
There's a phenomenon called that some people locally know it as the Atherton lights. There's a bottom. There's a Little Blue River bottom. Is about a half a mile away from my house. We live kind of up on the ridge, up on the river bluff. there's been times where I've had, campfires out by the front yard where I have seen some strange lights, and I have a friend of mine who has since passed away. He used to go run those roads at night a lot of times, and he's seen them several times, and they're like balls of light. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to start looking into that. I mean, I've seen something like that out at the Browns property, but I'm pretty sure it was someone's headlamp. But I've talked to probably 10 or 15 people in the last 2 weeks who are completely sane, and said, hey, you ever seen balls of light out there flying around at night? And first time some guy said it to me, I said, well, I don't know about balls of light flying around. I saw a light one time. But I mean, it could have been a headlamp. And he was like, no. He's like, this is different. He's like, and then he starts describing it as like a plasma ball of light flying around. And when I was down there in Texas, I almost went down. Bob Garrett said there's a place, they just call it lights. I asked Bob about it. I said, Bob, have you ever heard of anyone talking about these lights flying around at night? He got real quiet. He was like, yeah. And they started showing me pictures. And then he started showing me videos that he had of them. And I was just like, holy crap, what is that? Like, he has a video of like this blue, maybe a little bit smaller than a basketball, blue light. Looks like it's flying around on its own. It looks like it's like almost kind of being controlled by something flying around. And I was like, what the heck is that? And he's like, well, this is that lights place I was telling you about. He's like, it's almost a nightly basis. And he goes, we followed them into the woods one time, and he said that was a really bad idea because he said we just kept going deeper and deeper and deeper, and the group separated, and then they realized that, they were practically lost. But I mean, he's got video after video after video and pictures of these lights flying around. And, I mean, it's not something, Bob's about as honest as they come, but, you see these videos and I was just like, what the heck is that? And he wanted to take me to the area, and I wasn't sure that I really wanted to, go to the area. I talked to a Native American who, he's pretty nuts and bolts on everything. And I brought up the lights with him. He's out here in Washington State, and he got real abrupt with me. He said, what do you want to know? And I said, well, I just want to know what they are. He goes, just stay away from them. And I was like, crap. I go, is it a bad thing? And he goes, yeah, they're a bad thing. Stay away from them. If you see those lights, you turn around and you go back the way you came. Don't go to them. Don't
follow them.
Don't follow them. Yeah, he's like, you just stay away from them. And so it got me wondering, and he's very nuts and, I mean, for Native American, a lot of times they're not really nuts and bolts on much of anything. I know my family's Apache, and they'll tell you stories about stuff that's not really in reality. But this guy's very, very nuts and bolts. And he was like, stay away from them.
It's weird. There's a metaphysical reality to life. There are some things that are, unexplainable, at least right now by science.
Oh yeah, there's a lot.
And I'm definitely far from the camp of the flute players and going out and visiting the forest friends. I'm a member of a couple of those groups just so I can get their posts and laugh about it because they're so freaking hilarious.
Yeah.
They're funny, but this Bigfoot Sasquatch phenomenon, this is a real flesh and blood creature, and they are balls out dangerous, and they can kill you. They could kill you real fast and get away and dispose of the body real fast, and you'd never be heard from again.
A lot of the what I call the flute players is, I think there is some people who experience weird phenomena that are, if they're experiencing like telepathy and all this other stuff, this is my own personal opinion. And let's just say for a moment, all of that's legitimate. I think there's something else going on there. I don't think that's Bigfoot related.
Yeah,
I really
it's not Bigfoot. Even if they're visually seeing something that looks like Bigfoot, it may not be a Bigfoot. It may be something that's mimicking darker. A Bigfoot.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I've always thought. I mean, for the most part, I think a lot of these people are delusional in their thinking. But every once in a while, you'll run across someone who seems pretty sane that'll tell you some weird things. And what's funny is they don't go blasting it everywhere. They're kind of like, well, hey, I got to tell you this, but I don't want you to think I'm crazy. And then as we're talking, it's like, I don't think I believe you. I just don't think that has anything to do with Bigfoot. I think that's something darker messing with you. I just do. I could be, wrong. I don't think I am.
Before I got exposed to the show and before I got exposed to some of the other, researchers out there that have aggressiveness, and heard some stories about, I was like leaving, I would go out and I'd leave a pile of apples out in the woods. I don't really do that now because I don't want, if they are out there right at certain time, I don't want them to expect that I'm going to feed them and then come knocking at my door or whatever, or pounding on the side of my house expecting to be fed.
Right.
If that's what's really going on, if that's really the Bigfoot doing that. I don't know, man. There's a lot we don't know.
Yeah, I'd like to solve that lights thing. It's been really bugging me, the lights thing, just because I've talked to so many sane people that are like, hey, have you seen these lights? And like I said,
my dad was a police officer, and they chased one out. They chased some lights outside of Maryville, Missouri, in their police cars in 1976. There's an actual police report on it. And my dad is the only one out of my family that even believed me with the Bigfoot.
What did your dad say he thought the lights were?
He didn't really know. He said they were in Maryville. They chased them out of Maryville in the police cars, or followed them, and they came really close to the cars, sped by really fast, and he said they actually spit out other lights from them, and then just took off really fast and disappeared, like really fast.
Yeah, that's the other thing that I've heard too from researchers is that the lights will break off and into other lights, and it could be a simple explanation like it's a living organism, I don't know, plasma or something, but it's just odd. You hear it, and I'm starting to hear more and more and more about these lights, and when I start seeing videos of them and pictures of them, I don't know if I'd really call it, I guess you call it an orb, but it's more like a plasma ball is kind of what I saw in the videos and pictures, but
I don't know if they're linked. I'm not gonna come out and say that they're linked because I don't want to be, necessarily labeled a nutcase any more than I already am.
Yeah, no, I don't know that they're linked. I know that it's always people out in the woods. I've heard hikers tell me that don't believe in Bigfoot, that told me about these lights. And they were out just as the sun was, right before it got really, really dark. They saw these lights flying around. And these aren't even Bigfoot people. They're just hikers that, and I've had hunters tell me the same thing. That I had one hunter who absolutely doesn't believe in Sasquatch. He thinks it's a joke. And him and I got to talking, and then he started talking about these lights he was seeing. And he saw them right before the sun was coming up. He was up in his tree stand, and he was telling me about this light that was flying through the forest. And I asked him, I said, well, how big do you think it was? And he goes, maybe a little bit bigger than a softball, but smaller than a basketball. And he goes, it was kind of a blue color. And he said it kind of lit up the trees as it went by. And he said it looked like it was steering its way through the forest, and then it just took off. And he goes, it wasn't a UFO or anything. It was just this weird ball of light flying around. And he said it seemed like it came out of nowhere, was flying around, and then it took off. You know, I asked him what he thought it was, and he's like, I have no idea what it was. It was the weirdest thing you ever saw.
Well,
Yeah.
when you asked me that, Wes, I was like, well, how does Wes know about the Atherton lights? I was like, wait a minute, why is he asking me this? Because I didn't know that was a really common thing that people were seeing.
Yeah, I didn't either, and I didn't think that a lot of people were seeing them, and in a lot of different states. People here in Washington State tell me they've seen him. Down in Texas, they tell me they've seen him. Oklahoma, they tell me they see him. Missouri, I mean, on and on and on. And it's just not Bigfoot guys that are telling me that. You know, I've had hikers. One guy enjoys the show. He doesn't really believe in Bigfoot, but he's like, hey, I want to ask you something about these lights. And asked me if I'd ever seen these lights. And I said, well, I saw a light one time out at the Browns. I don't know that I'd call it like a plasma ball or an orb. I'd say it's more like, it reminded me of a headlamp, to be honest with you. And he's like, no, this is something different. So he starts explaining to me what he saw. And, you know, this guy was sane. And I was like, yeah, I have no idea. And then I had a couple of researchers tell me that they saw these lights and were asking me if I'd ever heard anything like that. More and more witnesses come forward and say, oh, by the way, have you seen these lights? And I remember when right before I went to Texas, I asked Bob about it. I said, Bob, have you ever heard of these lights people are seeing? And he goes, I'll show you when you get down here. And then he started showing me what he had on video and pictures, and I was just blown away when I saw it. I was just like, oh my God, what in the world is that? You know, flying around. But
this is a little bit off the reservation of what we're talking about, but it's been coming up in some posts in the group. What's your opinion about Melba Ketchum's study?
Here's my deep down off the record concern about Bigfoot. I hope to God these things aren't the Nephilim. I don't think they are.
Oh my gosh.
I think it's a primate.
Yeah.
Because they're very animalistic. I think that, but in the same breath, you know, I mean, what I saw, I'd consider a giant. I mean, what Woody and I saw that night, I would consider a freaking giant. I mean, it'd take a man, make him 9-10 feet tall and about 1,000 pounds. And that's kind of what we saw. It walked a little bit weird. Its body language kind of reminded me of an ape. Just the way it moved and the way it's kind of longer arms. But the thing was a giant. There's no questioning that this thing was a freaking giant. I think there's been a lot of things, you know, like Will had brought up one time that Melba said that she was mentally raped and that she was physically raped. Well, she's never technically ever really said that. This is something I've learned real recently. She never really said, that's something Justin Smeha said that she said. And so she's never actually said that. She clarified that on Coast to Coast. She's like, I've never said that. That's ridiculous. I'm not a DNA expert. I wish I was. I was going to buy the paper and actually take it. I have there's a DNA guy down here at the local college. I was going to, get a copy of the paper and then take it down to him and say, can you dumb this down as much as possible and explain it to me? I honestly, man, I think the way it was presented, I think the way she presented it destroyed, I think there were so many mistakes made. It kind of destroyed the credibility of the study. I know there's a couple things. I know when there is human contamination, that's really easy to take out. So anytime you have any sort of human contamination, you can actually take that out. It's not like, well, this is contaminated, we got to throw it out. They can filter that stuff out.
That's what I thought too.
Yeah, and so I don't buy the whole, well, everything was human contaminated. But in the same breath,
all 116 samples or however many they were.
Right. But in the same breath, if you take, let's say we didn't know chimps existed.
Sure.
And let's say no one knows anything about a chimp. And then let's say Melba Ketchum came along and did a DNA, ran DNA on it. A chimp is like 98, 99% the same DNA makeup that we are. I almost wonder, would she have the same results? Would she come back and go, hey, this is almost human. This is basically a human being out there running around. So that's kind of where I get lost on, I think a lemur, like chimps, a lot of people don't know, we can actually do a blood transfusion with a chimp, and as long as the blood is the same type, it'll work.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, we can actually transfuse our blood into them. If they need a blood transfusion, our blood will work with them as long as it's the same type, just same theory as with humans. It's the same theory. It has to be the same type of blood. And so I almost wonder if nobody knew anything about chimps, knew absolutely nothing. They were just this hidden forest ninja. And then all of a sudden we start bringing DNA of chimps to someone like Melba or a lemur, for example, which is even closer than a chimp to us. But if you brought
They are?
Yeah, a lemur is actually close. A lemur is, out of all the primates, lemurs and us are almost identical. There's like a
That's weird.
I think there's like a 0.5% difference between our DNA and their DNA. And so we're so close that it makes me wonder, if she ran something like that, would she come back and say, well, this is obviously a human being out there running around. These are a type of people out there running around, which someone could still argue because their DNAs are so close. But I guess to answer your question, man, I'm just kind of on the fence. I would like to hear from someone else that looked at this, who's actually, has accolades, could come and say, yeah, you know what, this is what we found, and can kind of break it down, because you can hide behind a DNA study too, because no one knows,
From what I understand, she's breaking it down as that the matrilineal DNA is human, like the mother side is human.
Right.
The father side is an unknown primate, which to me, if that is true, that does scream Nephilim.
Absolutely.
That totally says, dude, that's a Nephilim. And that's a pretty dark subject if you dive into that, down that rabbit hole.
Well, the thing about the Nephilim, though, too, is that they were, if you read a lot of the ancient texts from Mesopotamia, beyond just, you go outside the Bible and just start reading some of these texts, you realize really quick, not only were these things giants, but they were way more intelligent than we are. Their mathematics, their knowledge of the stars, on and on and on and on, is way above anything that we know of. And they were just generally smarter and bigger and stronger and just more. But with the Sasquatch, it seems more animalistic. It just seems, my own experience seems very animalistic.
If it's a de-evolution of sorts, if they've been driven to that wilderness and they're maybe even degraded, who knows? I mean, it's all speculation, at this point. Yeah, I would be more comfortable with them being a giant ape, for sure. From my own spiritual perspective and everything else, I would be way more comfortable with them being a giant ape.
And I really think they're some sort of, I still think there's some sort of primate. I really do. If it came out that these things were the Nephilim, I think I'm done with the show, and we need to slaughter every single one of them we see.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's kill them. Let's kill them all. Yeah, they're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yeah, and the other thing, some witnesses will say that, they've seen these things, they've seen compassion with these things, they've seen, and I don't know if any of that's true or not, but compassion really wasn't in the makeup of the Nephilim. There were giant monsters that were wicked, and when they weren't killing people, they were basically ruling the earth, you know. And so I think that if these things, enslaving them. And so I think if these things, you know, it's just not the case with these things. You know, these are more like wild, I hate to say monkeys, but like wild monkeys out there running around. You know, like the growling you described. You know, I've heard these things growl, and it's not human. I can tell you that much.
No.
It's not human. Not even close.
No, it's something beyond. And I do think that they're very, you know, they may be more intelligent than us in certain ways because there's so many different types of intelligence. You know, there's spatial intelligence, there's, you know, survivability intelligence. As far as that goes, dude, they got us beat hands down. They're born into it, and they don't ever leave it. So, you know, one could hide behind a tree, and you'd never see them unless they move, because they know exactly where they're at.
Yeah, I don't think it's too hard to outsmart humans, especially if you're a wild animal. It's kind of like this Jane Goodall documentary I was watching the other day, where she went to look for these chimps, and when she got there, she didn't think that chimps were actually there because she never saw them. She never heard them. She never saw them. And she actually almost ended up leaving the island because she was like, there's no chimps here. And then one day she saw one, and then realized that they were there. And it took her years and years and years and years to, you know, and even her situation, she was attacked by them. She had, you know, she said that some of them were crazy. Some of them were vicious. One smashed her head with a rock and then kicked her in the stomach and thought that she was dead, so it walked off. She got up, started wiping the blood off. It came back with another rock and smashed her across the head again, and then tried to kick her off a cliff. And so, you know, they can snap just as quick as someone else, and some of them are crazy and brutal. And I think it's the case with these things. You know, it's like when I had Bob Gimlin on. You know, his encounter really wasn't terrifying, to the sense that it just kind of stood, you know, Patty just kind of stood up, looked at them, turned around and walked away.
Now, when you look back, that was when Bob got off his horse, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
When he was to look back.
Right. He was riding across the creek, and she turned back to look at him to see what he was doing. But, you know, some people have encounters like that, and I think that, you know, you can have a different opinion of these creatures. But, you know, I think a lot of people, even if they don't have an aggressive encounter, like you were saying earlier, they got to beware a little bit, because I don't think these things are anything to be messed around with.
No, you could make, you know, one wrong, you know, social cue move to them would be just normal, and they could construe that as either a threat or a challenge for dominance, and it'd be on.
I had a guy tell me one time that he came face to face, and they had kind of a standoff. They were looking at each other. He was out hunting. He made the mistake of smiling at it, and he said he didn't think anything of it. He didn't think that was, and he said this thing went crazy the moment he did that. It started shaking brush and throwing rocks at him and growling, and, you know, and in the primate world, a smile isn't a happy gesture to another one. Usually you're about to show your teeth right then, and it's go time to fight. And so you're right. I mean, you could just make a simple mistake and not think anything of it, and all of a sudden things go bad really quick.
Well, you can do that. That's one thing about dogs that you don't want to do either. Because you don't want to, if it's a strange dog, you don't want to smile and show your teeth.
Right.
Because if it's the wrong dog, they'll think that that's a challenge or that you're about to bite them.
But you know what I mean? I mean, not everyone has a terrifying encounter, and I think when they don't have a terrifying encounter, sometimes people have this misconception of, well, these are the happy forest giants, and just from encounters that people have come forward with, I mean, it's just not the case. They're not the happy forest giants.
Yeah, they're really not. They're really not. I totally agree. So, yeah,
well, Mike,
I really appreciate you. Dude, the pleasure was mine. I'm honored that you wanted me to be on there. So
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for visiting with me. It was good to talk to you, bud. Okay, man. Have a good one.
Hey, you too.
All right.
Next on the show, we have Michael D., who sent me his encounter, and I wanted to go ahead and welcome Michael to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. I want to welcome you to the show. Mike, can you tell us what you were doing right before the encounter and then kind of walk us through the encounter?
Oh, yeah, no problem. Like I said, this happened several years ago. Like, I think it was 99 or 2000. So, I was still pretty young then, like 13 or 14. But a friend and I, we were just kind of hanging out. Like, where I lived at the time, there was a man that owned, like, a lot of property, like, on a road. Or we, like, was kind of in a rural area, so he had, like, several acres, and we would kind of just go back out there and hang out, like, ride dirt bikes, trail bikes, whatever. And he didn't really mind as long as we didn't, like, mess around or, like, vandalize the area or anything like that. But that day, my friend and myself, we were just, kind of walking back there a ways, pretty deep. Just, like, the trail went on throughout the woods for, like I said, a good ways. It might have been, like, maybe a mile back in there. Pretty heavy forest, and then it kind of opens up to, like, a pond. And, yeah, we were just basically just meandering around that day. So.
And then what happens? You guys are out walking around, but you said by a pond?
Yeah, like I said, the trail, it kind of opens up to like a pond on our left side, and we came out, and as we were rounding like the edge of that pond, I was probably like around 50 yards or so ahead of me, like on the tree line, like I saw something like moving in the bushes, like right on the edge, and yeah, I was not expecting to see that. So.
What did you see, and how far away was it?
Like I said, it was roughly 50 yards, I'm assuming, but what I saw initially, out of the corner of my eye, something large and dark, like moving pretty violently. And once I looked over at it, and I saw this large, I think described like black fur-covered, thing, basically just hunched over in the bushes, and it looked like it was foraging for something, or thrashing its arms and maybe looking for something. And I kind of stood there like a second, like not really like know what I'm looking at, and it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person. The thing that stuck out the most about it to me was like how massive the shoulder span was. I mean, literally, like this thing, if I was to lay down flat, it would probably be from head to toe to how like wide this thing was, And yeah, I don't even think it noticed at that point because it was still just kind of doing whatever it was, like looking for something in the bushes. And I mean, this thing's arms were huge. Like, I've never seen anything like that before in my life. And by the time I actually registered what, that was, my friend and myself, we turned the opposite directions, booked it out of there.
Was the creature standing up? Was it bent over? Was it kneeled down?
It was kind of crouching, like how you would, like, if you, like, dropped a quarter or something, you kind of bend down to pick it up. And it was just, like, squatting.
What did so you guys take off. What happened next? Did you and your friend just kind of talk about what happened next after that?
Yeah, we didn't stop running until we got out of, the area back to, the main part of the road where it opens up to the homes. Yeah, we got back to my house and we sat down and we were both still pretty freaked out. And we just kind of, talked about like, well, I asked him, what did you think you saw? And he was like, I don't know, man. He's like, first he was like, well, it couldn't be a bear just because of, how big that was. And we don't have that kind of animal in this area anyway. And the thing that, to me, which was strange, is I didn't really see like a head, so to speak. Like it was, I guess it was like, maybe it's because of the direction it was like facing the ground. It was just so like broad. It was almost like flat, completely across. And yeah, we saw no face, nothing like that. But yeah, you can definitely see the arms. And this, the only thing that came to mind was like, it looks exactly like, a Sasquatch. At that time, I had like, not really an interest in it, but I was aware, of, Bigfoot, things like that, Yeti and Nepal. But I had no idea, like, as far as like how many sightings across the world and country there are. I always thought about like the Pacific Northwest or the Himalayas, and that was really like my only knowledge at that point in time.
And where did this encounter take place, Mike?
Oh, it was in Alabama.
And did you guys ever brave it back down the trail ever again, or was that pretty much it for that?
That was actually the last time I went to that part of that area. I still like to go into the woods myself, but I haven't been out there in years. So. But yeah, we both agreed, that's what we saw, and it was very frightening. Like it's one of those kind of the fight or flight reflex you get when you see something. Like it just automatically my gut thing is just to get out of there.
Yeah, I think that's what most people's reactions would be. What did it change it didn't change your view on going back out in the woods?
For a while it did. I remember just because of my age, like I was kind of nervous, like at nighttime, like I would make sure my blinds and curtains were closed. Or I was thinking, like, I don't want some this thing looking through my window or whatever. But I mean, after a while, I'm still aware of that, and I think about it from time to time. But no, I mean, I still go out to the woods and stuff. So.
How long ago did this happen, Mike?
99 or 2000. I mean, it's been several years, but I remember it pretty vividly. It's been like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it always kind of sticks with you.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to thank you for being on the show, Mike. I wanted to thank you for sharing the encounter. It's terrifying, man, when you're out there and you just come across something you've never seen before, and it didn't seem like it.
It's kind of weird. I don't think the thing even noticed we were there at first, but I'm sure it probably heard us when we were running back up the trail. But yeah, that was something else.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on.
No problem. Yeah, I guess I apologize for not being a terribly exciting story or terrifying, but
No, they're all exciting. No, and there's no apology for that because everyone's encounter is different. I know a lot of people are like, well, I don't know if I should come forward because it's not that exciting, but I think every encounter is exciting. It's something you've never seen before. It's something you have never experienced before. And so even if you're in a car driving along and one crosses a road, that's still life-changing for someone. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and even when you say that, that's something people don't normally see, but I'm kind of in the mindset of I would rather not see something like that again. If it makes sense. Especially considering your story,
I was talking with the last guest, and it's like you can't unsee some things in life, even though you wish you could. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Mike, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing your story. Next up, we have Brad.
Hey, Wes.
I want to welcome you to the show, Brad. I wanted, the encounter you and I talked yesterday about, I was kind of wanting you to go into today. Can you tell the audience what you were doing right before the encounter, and then kind of what led up to the encounter and kind of what you saw?
Well, we were, we had rented a 30-foot Winnebago from U-Haul back in 1986, and our family, me and my dad and some of our friends, traveled up to the World's Fair in Vancouver in 1986. That's where we were headed, but we meandered our way along up there from El Paso, Texas. And we were desert people, so we were very impressed with all of the forests that we ended up traveling up into. And I was able to reserve the whole back side of the camper, and then my father and our friends were playing poker and switching off driving, and I never did any of that. I just kept the back gate closed, and I had the whole queen size bed. The whole back of the camper was pretty much reserved just for me. We didn't camp in it. We just traveled in it. We stayed at hotels at night. So
and how old were you?
I had.
And how old were you?
That was in 1986. I was 21. I think. I'm 52 now, so however the math works out.
Right.
I just know, I did the math to see how long it's been, and it's been 29 years since the sighting, and you're the first person I've ever talked to that I have confidence in that has ever saw Bigfoot besides myself. So I've gone 29 years without anyone that I believe would believe me.
Well, I appreciate that.
I appreciate it as well.
So you guys are driving along, and you're in Vancouver, which is my hometown. What kind of happened? Are you in the back of the camper now? And where are you guys at? General area where are you at? Just out in the forest, or?
Well, yeah, it seemed like we were paralleling Washington and Canada, the Canadian border. We took about a week and a half to get up there, so we just zigzagged all over the place, and it seemed like we were coming in to Vancouver from east to west, and we were on a narrow 2-lane road that was paralleling a small river, and the river had been on the same side of the road for quite a while, and where we stopped the night before, we were about 3 hours away from getting to the border to make it to the World's Fair. We were about 3.5 hours outside of the Canadian crossing. I wasn't familiar with any of these areas, and I wasn't in charge of driving. I didn't have to worry about anything. I was just kicked back in the back, looking out this panoramic window at all of the forest and this river that we had been traveling next to for quite a while. In fact, I had a video camera, and that had the tape cassette that was the film, and I had used up all the battery filming out the window at all of the scenery. It was just the woods and the river on the right side of the camper, and it was the road, and then about 40 feet of easement between the road and the shore of this side of the river, and then it went across the river about 100 feet, and it was a shallow river. It wasn't a deep running river. Maybe some portions of it were, but the road kind of followed the river. They paralleled each other for hours. And so the batteries ran low, and I sat the camera down, and I settled in to where I just laid my head against the window, the back side of the window, where I was looking way up as we were driving along. And I was so glad that I did that, because it was way upstream that I actually saw movement of something stepping out of the woods and sliding off about a 3-foot embankment into the river, and then taking another step, settled down into the bottom of the river, and then started walking out. It had taken maybe three steps out into the river before it got up to where I noticed that it was looking in our direction upstream, like it was looking both ways before crossing a street. He looks all the way upstream, and then as the Winnebago is creating a 90-degree angle between us and him and the river, he looks up at the Winnebago as it's crossing in front of him, and I felt like we actually had contact, but he was walking with purpose, and I could see how our Winnebago was not causing him to change his mind. He was coming across. I think he knew the Winnebago was coming down the street as he was stepping out. The cars just weren't crossing this river. But it didn't look like he was in a hurry. It just looked like he was coming across, and that was just going to be the way it was. And then as he looks up at the Winnebago and crosses eyes with me, because I'm looking out this big picture window. I'm centered in this big picture window, and I can't help but think that he wouldn't see me on my knees sitting up in the middle of this picture window looking straight at him at this point. And then he continues while he's striding, taking nice, calm strides. His arms are kind of swinging with his strides. He looks the other direction, in the direction that we're heading, all the way upriver, and then in a fluid motion, as his arms he wastes no energy, and it's just perfect fluidness as he spins his body around in a 180-degree turn, and then he starts taking the same steps back the way he came. And then as I'm pushing my forehead against the window, as I'm watching him, as we've already passed him, he takes the same steps up in the same spot he slid down out of before, and I'm able to watch him walk back into the forest, and he's gone. And so I wasn't asking this question at the time, which was the important question to me. Why would he come out and seemingly not be intimidated by us, and then after he looked upstream, would he decide then to turn around and walk back up until we got further down the river? I know I told you it was about 10 seconds yesterday when we talked, but the more I thought about it, I'm certain he was closer than that, because we came up on a sandbar not long after we passed him, and there at the sandbar, I see a man in a silver Toyota Land Cruiser. Now, this was in 1986, and so I'm thinking it's an early model 80s Toyota Land Cruiser, and I can tell that it has a little bit bigger tires on it than the factory tires. And then I see him, at the same time I see this adult black and tan Doberman running along the sandbar. He is waiting for what now appears to me an adult female drops out of the passenger side of this Toyota, and he's closing the passenger side door as he let his two dogs out on the sandbar to run. And the female starts running a little faster to catch up with the male who was let out first, and he's standing next to Toyota, not even realizing that how much distance could they travel in that period of time, maybe 100 yards upriver. This Bigfoot, and it wasn't us who caused him to turn around. It was this Toyota that had just parked on the sandbar, and he was letting his dogs out to run. They were there in what looked to be a really nice spot to hang out on the river, an area where no one else was, where he could just let his dogs run and enjoy the water and the shallow sandbar. I saw by his body language that he had no idea what I had just seen. We just continued on down the road as I continued to process all of what had just transpired.
Can you describe to the audience what you saw?
I'm very familiar with animals. I mean, from a young kid, I saw that the Patterson-Gimlin film when I was a young kid. I'd gone to a matinee, a Saturday matinee, and between films, they showed a short clip, and it was the Patterson-Gimlin film. So I was able to see that, but that was my only real exposure to Bigfoot, and so I never thought about Bigfoot. When I was raised military, and we would go to different areas of the country, including Fort Wainwright, Alaska, which is in Fairbanks, and I never thought about something like this as I would do my day and overnight trips as a single young person. I explored a lot. And that was kind of what I did as a pastime that didn't cost money. That's what I did. I enjoyed nature. And so I've gone to the zoos a lot, and I'm real familiar. I even took an avian assistance course, veterinarian assistance course in Phoenix, because I thought that that's what I was going to do, was I was going to continue being involved with animals so that I could maybe go to work for a zoo or something. I was working on my experiences to be able to put on a resume. I was very familiar with most animals. And when I saw this creature step out into the forest, my brain started going into shock. It was almost like alarms were going off inside my head. And I could sense later, after the incident, I had taken in a lot of information, and then I started sorting it and analyzing it, and I realized what I'd seen. And he looked to me, I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, and so I follow the Utah Jazz, and and they had a player called named Karl Malone, and he was a big man with wider shoulders than most of the NBA players, and I was always impressed by him. And that's the body style of this Bigfoot that I saw, except that he was taller, but he was slender. To me, he was a young male, because he didn't look to me like he was starting to fill out, like maybe a 21-year-old human, 22, 23-year-old human, you know, and as we get older, we start to fill out, our shoulders start to fill out, because he still didn't have all that shoulders up into his neck, up into his head like we see now. And I really don't even know how to categorize him, because from what I've learned now, there are the different body shapes. There are different types of Sasquatch and Bigfoot. So, but it was in the middle of the day. He stepped out right in the beautiful daylight. It was a sunny afternoon, about 2:30 when it happened. The sun was up. His fur he had a dark brown undercoat. I say fur because it was so thick. I mean, it was, I couldn't see skin anywhere on his body. I couldn't see genitalia because he had so much. If it's hair, it's very thick hair. If it's fur, one thing that I was surprised about was how clean he was. I mean, he was very groomed looking, and he almost looked like he had bangs, because I could see some parts of his face that had no hair. I mean, he was only 150 feet away, not yards, but feet, 150 feet away. So I could see him pretty good. But I was looking at the whole picture. I wasn't isolated to just, I was seeing how deep he was in the water, which is a little deeper than the knees, and then from the knees up to the top of his head. And so I was looking at the whole thing rather than scanning any particular parts of him. I mean, the genitalia wasn't obvious because it was covered in hair or fur. I don't know whether it was hair or fur, but he was a dark brown undercoat with sun highlights. It's toward the middle of summer. And so I know I told you I thought it was, blonde highlights, but it wasn't blonde highlights. It was dark brown to a mahogany to a red, and then the red, and then the highlights that I was telling you were blonde were actually more of a copper coat. So he never got into the blonde at all.
After you saw this creature, you're coming from, you said El Paso?
Yeah.
What did you think when you saw it? Were you just like, what the hell's going on here in Washington State?
No, I mean, I definitely thought, I'll tell you what, the first thing I thought was it did not resemble Patty, but what are the odds of seeing the only one? Actually, what went in my mind as soon as I could actually start thinking on my own, instead of the flight or flight response, not a fight or flight, but I was experiencing a flight or flight response. I knew I was fleeing. I just was, you hear these guys all the time talking about how it's all involuntary. I was going into shock, actually, what I describe as shock, because I'm 52 now and I've experienced a bunch of things with my physical body and I've gone into shock before. But that was the closest I ever came to fainting out of fear. Or fainting. I've never fainted in my life. I've come close to being knocked out twice. But I've never fainted. But that was the closest I ever came. I was so afraid. I was so in shock that I think I caught myself an hour later laying down, and I think I was in the fetal position, and I was just staring at the paneling on the wall when I kind of came to. I mean, I didn't do anything. I didn't yell to my dad, who was driving at the time, stop, I gotta run across to see if I can find tracks. I didn't do anything like that. I was in shock. I could not even speak.
I wanted to ask you, after you saw this creature and you guys are driving, did you ever stop and go, hey, Dad, I'm not sure what I just saw, or did you talk to anyone else in the Winnebago about what you saw?
I lost the opportunity. That's why I asked myself, what would I do differently? I lost the opportunity to where a couple of days later, I brought up the subject and I tried to talk about it, but it had lost its momentum. It had lost its opportunity. I needed to convince these guys I should have initiated the opportunity right then when it happened, because none of them took me seriously. They don't consider me a liar, but they also consider me a jokester. I have a sense of humor. I like to laugh. I like to have a good time. And so what better area up there to create a story than, then? Because we're from the desert. We don't hear about Bigfoots and stuff like that where we're at in West Texas. It just doesn't seem like a habitable area for them. The scrub brush just isn't thick enough for them to really hide.
After you have an encounter like you did, and it's so outside of your frame of reference, you kind of do go into shock. And so I can understand not going, hey, stop, because you just saw what you saw and you're trying to figure out, okay, what did I just see? So, I mean, I kind of understand that. It's kind of a shame that you had to hold this in for, almost 30 years, what you saw and that day. Did it kind of change your reality as far as going out in the woods?
It didn't, because I didn't know. I didn't know about Bigfoot and Sasquatch till I started researching. I've been so busy with construction, working hard to take care of my family, that I don't have time for computers. It's just now recently in my life that the work that I do now in home repair, my clients are starting to force me to be involved in doing emails and doing my bids over email, through email, and so they're forcing me to have to get involved. But I didn't know. I mean, think about when the first Bigfoot series really started, and the public awareness really started. Not in the 80s. I mean, the only thing I remember from the 80s was that one deal they did with a few obscure documentaries, and the one the $6 Million Man episode, when they had a Bigfoot in one of the episodes there with the $6 Million Man, and it was just kind of hokey, it was obvious that it. But I thought the costume and stuff was pretty good, but it was also not believable. And so I didn't know about these creatures, and so I continued my adventures in the wilderness. And I mean, I'm an avid hunter, and I never worried about looking back, because I thought it was an isolated incident to the northwest. And now that I've done now that I've been learning about the creature and that it's an ambush predator, I sincerely believe that to be the case. Things are much different for me, and I'm worried, because my son and my daughter, they both love to hike, and they're old enough to where they organize their own groups and they go out independently from me. And now I'm worried, and I'm trying to talk to them about it, and they just roll their eyes because of the same old story that Dad told to not very many people, but definitely told them to his kids. My kids have known about this since they were born and growing up. I've often talked to them about it, but I don't talk to anyone else because, they just, it's hard to take somebody serious about something that is obscure and not. But now look at all the publicity that it's getting. People are starting to be subjected to it. Not that they want to be, but it's all over now. It's all over the TV.
I think you're right. A lot of people are starting to come forward, say, hey, I saw this out in the woods. And not only, and I don't think police officers are more credible than hunters, and I don't think, I think if people who come forward and say, hey, I saw this, but I mean, we have police officers, we have military professionals, we have hunters, we have, you know, I've had 2 judges on the show, we've had lawyers, we've had, you know, I mean, everyone from all walks of life who are coming forward, and they're saying, hey, I saw this out in the woods. It's a little hard to, I mean, is everyone lying? Is everyone out there lying? You know, and is someone making tracks in every state, you know? And so, I mean, it kind of gets to the point to where it's starting to get to the point to now, I think people realize there's something out there. There's something people are seeing. There's something, you know, if you've never seen one and you listen to people's encounters, the one thing you'll get from encounters is generally everyone's describing the same thing. You know, I mean, there's some slight differences, and you'll get that with people. You know, with one person might see one thing, another person, you know, like I had Bob Gimlin on the other day, and
I heard that. I heard it. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was talking about how what he saw was different from what Roger Patterson saw. They argued about what they saw. Here's 2 guys that are probably 200 feet from each other looking at the exact same thing. Not only looking at the exact same thing, but they're filming the exact same thing. And, you know, they're filming it. And yet, the stories are a little bit different on what they saw. And I think that it just amazes me. It's all these people are coming forward. All these people are saying, hey, I'm seeing this out in the woods. And it's like, at what point are we just going to say, hey, you know what, this thing exists. Be careful when you're out there in the forest, because this thing's out there running around. People do see them. It'd be nice to get to that point, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's something that I want to learn more about. I never thought they existed. But now that I've seen it, you know, I could very well see it again, and I don't really want to see it again. I mean, I would like to see it in a controlled environment. Not on a slab, but I want to see it alive, maybe in a zoo. Maybe they can have a catch and release program or something to where they can do education, catch a couple, and then let them go in the same area that they found them a year later or something. Because I know the populations are growing so much that, you know, not only are we encroaching on their territories, but they're also growing in numbers.
Right.
And so, you know, how many more generations have to pass before we're already starting to cross over quite a bit.
It makes me think of Texas. You know, when I was in Texas, there's a farm not far from where we were at, and at night you'd hear gunshots going off, and I think they were coming from that farm. But I don't know if he's firing off warning shots or what he was firing off, but almost on a nightly basis you hear gunshots coming off from this farm, and going in the direction of where we were actually hearing noises of vocals and different things. And so I think you're right. I think that there's this tension between, and it might be hard for people to understand who live in a city that are listening to this or have never had a sighting listening to this, might think, oh, come on. But specifically in that area, I honestly think they're crammed in that area. I mean, when you go to a spot night after night after night, we're only talking like a 6-mile radius. But when you go to a spot night after night after night and you hear vocals going off and vocals going off and then gunshots going off, you know there's some tension there. I really wanted to talk to the farmer, but I was advised against it. I was advised that he doesn't talk to anyone. But I think you're right. I think there is I don't know about a controlled environment. It's kind of hard to capture a 8, 9, 10 feet tall, 1,000-pound.
Yeah, but you know there are ways. There are ways. I mean, they eat, and you know, catch them at their greatest weakness, is their stomach.
I really wanted to thank you for coming on the air and sharing your encounter.
Oh, no problem. No problem. I'm so thankful to be able to have somewhere that I have confidence in, to be able to come and talk about my experience, because like I said, you are the first person I've ever talked to that I believe has had a genuine sighting, that I have confidence that you now, you know, believe that the sighting I had is certainly possible, and it's credible, and and I know that there are other people out there who are shaking their heads. Yeah, I know what it is you're talking about, and I'm a part of the 100% club. There's no doubt. There's no doubt.
Yeah, I think it's more than just possible, and I think you're more than credible, and I can't thank you enough.